Hi guys, today we are going to be starting Flat Stanley. I made some flat versions of myself for my students, so these are some flat Miss Barnett's. I'm going to be passing those out next week when we do our work packet pass out. So my students will be getting a flat version of me to go along with Flat Stanley, and then after you listen to the book, you'll kind of understand about it a little bit more. When I was, I think, in 4th grade, we did a project with Flat Stanley. We read the original version of the book, which I couldn't find any copies of the original version, so we are reading Flat Stanley's Worldwide Adventures, which will still be perfectly fine. But we read the original Flat Stanley, and then we actually made our own Flat Stanleys and took them home, and we did activities with our Flat Stanley, took pictures of ourselves doing some activities with him, and we journaled about it to write about what we had done with our Flat Stanley. So my students are going to do something similar with their flat teacher. So you will do some activities, anything you do at home. You could read, you could build a fort, you could go running, you could play soccer. Just add me into whatever activity you are doing, and then you can journal about it, and I will be really excited to see what you guys do and what you write about. So we're going to read a couple chapters in Flat Stanley's Worldwide Adventures. This one is the Mount Rushmore Calamity, and chapter 1 is called Ready, Set. Sleeping bags? George Lambchop called out to his wife Harriet. Check, answered Mrs. Lambchop. Wholesome snacks for the boys? Check, replied Mr. Lambchop. The Lambchop family was preparing for their vacation to Mount Rushmore in the Black Hills of South Dakota. They were each very excited about the adventure. Mr. Lambchop was excited because he was going to collect another state park sticker for the rear window of the car. Mrs. Lambchop was excited because she was going to learn more about the history of South Dakota. Their younger son, Arthur, was excited because he was hoping to meet some real live cowboys. And Stanley, the Lambchop's older son, was excited because he was going somewhere nobody would recognize him. Not long ago, Stanley had awakened to find that his enormous bulletin board had fallen upon him during the night. Since then, the family had gotten used to having a flattened boy in the house. But when he ventured outside, he often caused a commotion. "Look, Marge, there he is, the famous flattened kid. Wonder what new adventures he's up to now." Or, "Say there, Flatty, mind if we take a picture?" The truth is, both Lambchop brothers were getting a bit tired of all the attention Stanley was getting. It would be nice, they agreed, to get away someplace where people didn't make such a fuss. "Well, I think we're ready," said Mr. Lambchop, surveying the mountain of suitcases and camping equipment in the hall. "Not quite, dear," replied Mrs. Lambchop. "Remember, we still have to consult Dr. Dan about Stanley's travel needs. Better safe than sorry." "Well, the boy is still flat," Dr. Dan pronounced when he was finished with his examination. There's Dr. Dan examining Stanley. "Yes, we know that," said Stanley's father. "We were wondering whether such a trip would be suitable for Stanley in his present condition. Mount Rushmore's elevation is 5,725 feet, for one thing, and we'll be traveling by automobile along the scenic highways at a fairly high velocity." Here Mrs. Lambchop interrupted her husband with a chuckle. "Not too high a velocity, of course," she said. Mr. Lambchop smiled at his wife's joke. Both she and Mr. Lambchop were always careful to obey local speed limits. "Still," he said, "we did feel it would be wise to check with you." "It's a good thing you did. More people should be concerned about the effects of travel on the body. The human being is a very complex organism. Even we doctors, with our extensive knowledge, don't completely understand it." "Oh, dear," Mrs. Lambchop said anxiously. "Will it be all right for Stanley to come with us?" "Of course," said Dr. Dan. "I can't think of any reason why not." And chapter 2 is called Go. The next day, after a hearty breakfast, the Lambchop family began to pack the car for their big trip. In went the tent, 4 sleeping bags, and the rest of the camping gear. In went the suitcases, the cameras, and coolers. Arthur came out with his arms full, his authentic cowboy saddle, his authentic cowboy harmonica, and his authentic cowboy lasso. "Oh dear," Mrs. Lambchop murmured. surveying the overstuffed car. "There doesn't seem to be much room for the boys." And there is Arthur with all of his cowboy stuff that he wants to take. "Playing cowboys is for little kids," Stanley said. "Now that I've been in the newspaper, I'm too grown up for that sort of thing. I think Arthur should leave all that stuff behind." Arthur glared at his brother. "Stanley can ride on the roof," he suggested. Mr. Lambchop considered this. "Well, if we lash him down securely." "I think not," decided Mrs. Lambchop. "We will be pointing out many sights along the way. I don't want Stanley to miss them." And so both boys squeezed into the back seat with much grumbling, and the family set out. Along the way, the Lambchops did indeed come upon many wondrous sights, inspiring cityscapes, fields of bountiful crops, and numerous glories of nature. "We should all be grateful to have good eyesight as we travel through this great land of ours," Mr. Lambchop noted. The rest of the Lambchops agreed. They were very fortunate indeed. Every time they crossed into a new state, the family recited its motto and sang its song. They played license plate bingo and I Spy, and the hours passed fairly quickly. Nonetheless, everyone was delighted to arrive at the gate of Mount Rushmore State Park. The boys craned their heads out the windows to gaze up at the 60-foot-tall faces carved in the mountain, while Mr. Lambchop paid the admission fees. And as soon as the car was parked, they sprang out. "I'm all crumpled," Stanley groused, trying to smooth himself out. "Well, I'm practically flattened," complained Arthur. "Boys, hurry along," said Mrs. Lambchop. "We're just in time to catch the last tour group." The Lambchops fell in with a group of cheerful-looking tourists. In 1937, the tour guide was telling them, a bill was introduced to add Susan B. Anthony as a fifth face. This bill failed, so today we still have the original four: Washington, Jefferson, Roosevelt, Lincoln, who is directly below us now. Mr. and Mrs. Lambchop were fascinated by the interesting facts the tour guide related, but the boys wandered away from the group. They were still feeling a little rambunctious after spending so many hours cramped in the car. They were also still feeling, it must be said, a little irritable with each other. "Ha ha," Arthur taunted his brother from the edge of the mountain. "I can stand right out here, but you can't. You'd blow away now that you're flat." Suddenly the ground shook. "Arthur," Stanley cried, "you'd better come back." With a terrible sound, a large crack split open along Abraham Lincoln's hairline. The great carved face began to slide away down the mountainside, with Arthur on it. Without thinking of his own safety, Stanley lunged out and grabbed hold of the retreating rock face. He held on tight. "Climb over me," he called to his brother. "Use me as a bridge." Arthur did. In a moment, he was back on firm ground, where Mr. and Mrs. Lambchop ran to embrace him. Just then, a park ranger appeared. "You, flat boy, can you hold on a little longer?" he called out to Stanley. The repair crew is on the way." Mr. and Mrs. Lambchop were indignant. "My son has a name," Mrs. Lambchop said. "It's Stanley." "Sorry, ma'am," the ranger said. "I should have known better, because the same thing happens to me, too. My name is Bob, as it says right here on my name badge. But to park visitors, I'm always just, 'Hey, Ranger.' It makes me feel very badly indeed, as you can imagine." Mrs. Lambchop forgave Bob, and Stanley held on until the emergency crew arrived to repair the crack. Only then did he let go. When he righted himself, he was surprised by a sea of flashing light bulbs. A reporter thrust a microphone in his face. "The boy who saved Mount Rushmore," one reporter crowed. "That will be my headline for the evening edition." "Brave boy becomes big Band-Aid," cried another. Off to the side, Arthur crossed his arms and frowned. "Famous again," he grumbled, "and nobody knows who I am." As soon as the reporters left, Stanley rejoined his brother in the large group that had gathered. Everyone was talking about the strange earthquake that had just happened. "That weren't no earthquake," muttered a voice behind the boys. "That was a gold mine." Stanley and Arthur turned to see a girl about Stanley's age, scowling. She was wearing a worn leather vest and chaps and dusty boots with big silver spurs. The boys introduced themselves. "Good to meet you, partners," the girl answered. I'm the tour guide's daughter. The name's Calamity Jasper. And that is the end of chapter 2. Chapter 3 is called Calamity Jasper. And we will work on chapter 3 next time we read. So I hope you enjoyed the first couple chapters of Flat Stanley, and I hope you kind of understand now more of the whole flat teacher, Flat Stanley, how Stanley became flat. So talk about that, think about that, and until we read next time.